5 a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. Teed up. The U.S. and China prepare a sweeping trade deal, setting it up for Presidents Trump and Xi to finalize when they meet Thursday. Argentina decides, the country voting in Javier Milei's party in Sunday's midterms, vindicating the U.S. administration's extraordinary support for the peso. And markets back in rally mode in the run-up to Wednesday's FOMC decision and the biggest week for earnings this season. To that effect, let's have a look at futures because they are pointed strongly higher. Don't forget, we're already at records in October alone to date. We're up 1.25% on the S&P 500, 2.25% on the Nasdaq 100. You have that, then you have an FOMC decision that's likely to be a cut, with potentially more dovish comments coming down the pike and a potential new Fed chair by the end of the year, at least announced. And then you have the biggest week for earnings season, 5 of the Mag 7 reporting Wednesday and Thursday. And of course, Presidents Trump and Xi potentially putting to bed some of the friction between them at this week's meeting. Let's take a look at yields because we are slightly higher. That safe haven trade, as you might expect, backing off just a little bit. We're back to 350 on the 2-year, the 10-year back above 4, and the 30-year yield back above 460. And let's take a look at the commodities trade as well because all of this de-escalation is giving us perhaps a little bit more optimism for global growth in general, the energy transition and so on. So you are seeing copper, for example, close to records today, oil backing off just that little bit. But let's get to some individual movers now. Over to London and Valerie Titel. Good morning, Valerie.
Good morning, Bonnie. Happy Monday. Risk on Monday, should we say? Let's start with a check on the gainers in the Mag 7. That is NVIDIA leading the Mag 7 gains up 2.1%. This is around optimism on these U.S.-China tensions thawing and those export controls when it comes to those key rare earths potentially delayed for a year when it comes to China. So NVIDIA at the top of the basket when it comes to those Mag 7s. Let's also have a check on rare earths. As I mentioned, Bessent hinted that those export restrictions from China could be delayed for up to a year. We are seeing those North American rare earth miners on a back foot off the back of this. MP Materials, which the Department of War has a direct stake in, down 6%. Critical metals and USA rare earths also down over 8%, just taking some steam out of this recent rally. Lastly, let's go on to the pharma sector. Bonnie, we've had some M&A news that Novartis has agreed to buy Avidity Biosciences for $72 a share, marking the biggest acquisition for Novartis in over a decade. We're seeing Avidity Biosciences trade up to nearly $72 a share, up 42% in the pre-market. Bonnie?
Wow, that is some move. Valerie, thank you so much. Valerie Titel there. And later this hour, we're going to catch up with Max Kettner of HSBC, so stick around for that conversation. But first, President Trump lands in Tokyo after wrapping up his meetings with ASEAN nations in Kuala Lumpur. To take us through the president's trip in Asia now, our team is on the ground. We have Avril Hong in Kuala Lumpur and Stephen Engel in Tokyo. So Avril, walk us through the talks that happened over the weekend. We had some breakthroughs.
Yeah, it was breakthroughs galore and a flurry of diplomatic activity. I mean, we saw the top members of the U.S. and Chinese trade negotiators, the delegations, really hunkering down in Malaysia in the past 2 days. 2 days of talks, which took place at the Merdeka 118, not far from where I am, by the way, the second tallest building in the world. And right there, those negotiations are expected to pave the way for their leaders, Trump and Xi, to ink out some form of a trade agreement when they actually meet in South Korea later this week on Thursday. Now, why this is significant in terms of what these trade negotiators have done in teeing things up for their bosses to seal the deal and finalize some form of agreement is that there was consensus on a number of contentious issues. And this is the signaling we're getting from both the U.S. and Chinese sides. And as you may know, when it comes to the Chinese negotiation style, they're not always so forthcoming in what the tactics might be behind the scenes, so that they are actually establishing some form of consensus on these contentious issues that include rare earths, soybean purchases, fentanyl, says a lot. Now, we are going to be shifting that focus, of course, to be looking at Trump and how he's progressing throughout Asia, the rest of the trip over to Japan and what is happening there next as well.
Yes, and to that effect, let's bring in Stephen Engel to ask what is the president going to be doing in Tokyo. Obviously, Sanae Takaichi has her own agenda as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Donald Trump has landed in Japan. He has by now probably already made his courtesy visit to the emperor in the imperial palace before possibly retiring for the evening. But tomorrow is going to be a busy day for President Trump. He will be having a morning meeting with the new prime minister, Sanae Takaichi. That will be an interesting dynamic to see these two new leaders get to know each other a little bit better. Of course, she is a protege of the former assassinated prime minister Shinzo Abe, whom Donald Trump recalls quite fondly. And of course, it was here at the Akasaka Palace, the state guest house, 6 years ago, where Donald Trump, and I was here as well, exactly same position, where Donald Trump came through and met Shinzo Abe. So I think he's going to want to pick up the same kind of rapport that he had with Shinzo Abe with his predecessor, Takaichi-san, who is widely considered to be a bit of more of a nationalist leader than the previous two prime minister, Kishida and Ishiba, who did not necessarily build out the same kind of rapport with the U.S. administrations of Biden and Donald Trump. So it will be interesting to see how their conversations will go on defense spending. Donald Trump no doubt wants the Japanese and the South Koreans to pick up a bigger percentage of the defense bill that the United States foots quite largely. Already Takaichi-san has said she's going to speed up her plan to increase defense spending in Japan to 2% of GDP. She's going to accelerate that by 2 years. And that's a highly controversial subject in Japan, which has a pacifist constitution, but might be music to Donald Trump's ears if Japan's going to spend more. But it still might not be enough. Europeans are talking about 5% of GDP. Japan just saying increasing to 2%. So there's a lot of issues. Japan is also buying Russian LNG. Donald Trump is going to try and convince Takaichi-san to wean Japan off that fuel from the Russians.
Okay, so defense and industrial collaboration on the agenda very much in Japan. Avril, I do want to ask you a little bit more about China, though, because Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying it's really down to crossing the T's and dotting the I's, but there are so many issues outstanding. Will we get something on the big ones, rare earths, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the main issues, right? As we know, China has been using rare earths as leverage since earlier in the year, imposing restrictions, and that has been used as a sort of point of contention when it comes to US-China trade negotiations. And we saw more recently it not only imposed restrictions on rare earths or signaled that it would do so, but also targeting the technology behind rare earths. So that is something of a pain point for the U.S. administration. As you know, they go into advanced products from jet engines all the way to semiconductors. For the moment, though, on that very rare earths issue, the idea from Scott Bessent that the Chinese seem a bit more willing to now delay these rare earths restrictions. Some indications that it could last for up to a year. That is a promising sign, and for the moment, at least allows the U.S. side to allay some of the supply chain risk when it comes to critical minerals.
Absolutely. Avril, thank you so much. And Stephen, that is Bloomberg's Avril Hong in Kuala Lumpur and Stephen Engel in Tokyo. Over in Argentina now, President Javier Milei's party won midterm votes yesterday in a major comeback. For more, Bloomberg's editor-at-large, Marty Schenker, joins us. So, Marty, what's next for the U.S.-Argentina relationship? Is there some kind of quid pro quo for this massive, extraordinarily, unusual aid that the U.S. gave Argentina, or is just the expected appreciation of the peso enough?
Well, it could be a significant factor in shaping what comes next. We have Scott Bessent did orchestrate this $20 billion lifeline, putting some assets of the U.S. at risk. But now that Milei has made this really extraordinary victory, the question becomes that second $20 billion package that the banks were supposed to put together, whether that now will, in fact, happen.
Marty, we are expecting that there will be some kind of deal inked for the aid of U.S. ranchers. In other words, some kind of a beef deal, I guess, but would that be enough for the United States, or would it want more in terms of national security collaboration, even in Latin America?
There's all kinds of things that the U.S. could negotiate. Now, this is the whole beef issue has become a vulnerable point for Donald Trump. Ranchers support Donald Trump, but they're very upset with the plan to import Argentine beef in the face of real significant increases in beef prices in the U.S. But Donald Trump is excellent at working both sides of the room, and I suspect he'll wind up accepting Argentine beef while placating the farmers in some way.
Absolutely. Marty, thank you so much. That is Bloomberg's Marty Schenker there for us. Now back in Washington, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent confirming 5 finalists to succeed Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Bloomberg's Jill Deesis joins us now. So Jill, it is 5 names that have been making the rounds for some time. I guess Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent took his own name out of the running, and he says we'll know by the end of the year.
Yeah, Vani, I think that timing on this idea of a decision expected by the end of the year, that's really kind of the operative news here. I mean, a lot of the names that we heard Bessent talk about in terms of these potential candidates, people like Christopher Waller, Michelle Bowman, so current members of the Fed. He also had mentioned Kevin Hassett, the White House National Economic Director. We've also got former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh, as well as BlackRock executive Rick Rieder. So, I mean, again, these are names that have been floating around for quite a while, and some of them have even really been floated, by Trump as potential candidates here. So really, I think the big thing here that we're hearing from Bessent, this idea that we could get a decision by the end of the year. Obviously, we've got a Fed meeting upcoming, but I think, more importantly than that, if there is some kind of a decision from the White House, an announcement on who they want to put forth as their next Fed chair, that does leave a certain period of time where you do still have Powell as the operative Fed chairman going into 2026 before he ultimately leaves, where you've got some overlap between, who the White House is positioning, and then obviously Powell leaving, but as we've seen over the last year, even beyond, there's just such a tense relationship here between Trump and Powell. So I think, you might continue to see Trump get a little bit more vocal but yeah, obviously operative there is maybe by the end of the year, we see who the White House wants to be the next Fed chairman.
Yeah, several meetings as well early next year. The other story that's, high up today is that Trump has now categorically said he will not run for vice president in 2028. That's significant because there had been some suggestion that he could run with another candidate, and then if that ticket were to win, that other candidate might step aside, leaving Trump to be president once more and not having to do anything with the Constitution. But he's not going to do that.
Yeah, so Vani, he asked about this on Air Force One during his Asia trip. He's saying, it's a bit too cute, that idea. I think really, Vani, what we really need to put in context here with where this entire thing really comes from is that, there are some supporters of the president that are essentially floating ways that they think he would potentially be able to circumvent constitutional rules that are in place about how many terms he can be president for. That's the 2 terms, by potentially, floating this hypothetical scenario. Really do want to make clear that this is a hypothetical scenario floated by some supporters there. Obviously, we do get that from the President of the United States there, but that really all kind of comes into that, idea of this, sort of contingent of people that sort of floating ways potentially that they could see him getting more than the 2 terms that, again, he's constitutionally entitled to, upon election to step in office. So I think that's just the one thing to really keep in mind there. But yeah, we did get that too cute response from Trump there.
Jill, thank you so much. Fantastic context there. That is Bloomberg's Jill Deesis. Coming up, Barclays re-entering Saudi Arabia after 11 years. We'll bring you our conversation with the CEO next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Barclays beefing up its operation in Saudi Arabia after exiting the business more than a decade ago. CEO CS Venkatakrishnan sat down with Bloomberg's Jumana Bersetchi at the Future Investment Initiative event in Riyadh. Take a listen.
The important thing about investment flows is it used to be out of the region into the Europe, into the United States, where of course we have a very strong presence. Now there's a lot coming back into the region. It's two-way. And I think that's the part where we can help.
Yeah, and I saw also that you acted as one of the book runners on the PIF's debut Euro green bonds. And what we are seeing is an increased amount of borrowing and issuance coming through from the kingdom. Surely that also presents an opportunity. It presents a great opportunity. The Saudi sovereign, the kingdom itself, is issuing a lot more sovereign debt. Institutions like the PIF, the one you mentioned, have. And it was great for us to be part of that bond, representing as it does both sustainability and Saudi. Okay, so we've spoken about investment banking. How are you viewing the growth of the wealth business in this part of the world as well?
So wealth is growing enormously, both the development of regional wealth and then actually the movement of people into Dubai, which is becoming a fairly big offshore center for wealth. We've got a presence there, and I think it is to help people, save and grow for the next generation and the generation after that. That's what the country of Saudi Arabia is doing through its institutions. That's what we want to help the people to do.
Yeah, we were reporting on how HSBC's Middle East wealth business was under scrutiny by the regulators, and it's impacted their ability to transact with a number of clients in the region. Do you sense this as potentially an opportunity to pick up market share in wealth?
No, look, I think there's enough room in the region for all the great banks. And what we will do is do it in our own way, in our own style, and hope to serve the region.
Okay, so you mentioned the number of people moving to Dubai, but we also hear, and we report on it on Bloomberg all the time, the number of asset managers, hedge funds moving to Dubai and Abu Dhabi as well. Do you see that as opening up an opportunity in the sense of maybe you can expand your prime brokerage services to cater for all of these asset managers that are moving to the region as well?
That's already happening. We've catered many of them through London, and we will look to follow our clients to where they are. And I think as the critical mass builds, you should expect us to see us do more and more in the region.
Barclays CEO C.S. Venkatakrishnan speaking there to Bloomberg's Jumana Bersetti at the Future Investment Initiative event in Riyadh. Now to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. First up, HSBC will set aside $1.1 billion to cover litigation by investors who lost money in the Bernard Madoff fraud. It's the latest global bank to face a significant hit from litigation dating back years. The provision will be recognized in HSBC's upcoming third quarter results. German business confidence improved to its highest level since 2022 at the start of the fourth quarter. An expectations index by the IFO Institute rose to 91.6 in October from a revised 89.8 in September. And over a period of 8 months, starting back in February, French billionaire Bernard Arnault bought roughly $1.6 billion worth of LVMH shares. This is according to Paris stock market filings. The purchases through holding companies occurred amid a sharp price decline triggered by weaker earnings and a broader industry retreat. Coming up, a look at what else is making headlines in your front page news. That's next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Time now for your front page news. First up, on the Wall Street Journal, a U.S. military helicopter and a jet fighter from the same aircraft carrier crashed into the South China Sea Sunday within 30 minutes of each other. 5 crew members from both aircrafts were rescued and are in stable condition. The Pacific Fleet says the cause of both crashes is under investigation. Next up, the Financial Times reporting the U.S. government's debt burden is on track to exceed levels in both Italy and Greece for the first time this century. Italy and Greece, of course, long highlighted for their fragile public finances. The FT quotes IMF forecasts saying general U.S. government gross debt will rise by more than 20 percentage points to reach 143.4% of GDP by 2029. And on the New York Times front page, California Governor Gavin Newsom telling CBS Sunday he will consider a 2028 presidential run after next year's midterms. Newsom is currently serving in his second term as governor of California. That ends in January of 2027. The New York Times saying he's positioned himself as one of President Trump's most visible Democratic antagonists. All right, let's take a look at markets because we are set up for a pretty bullish week in terms of futures. You can see that we are starting Monday where we left off Friday, pointed higher and continuing to set records. The dollar index, not too much movement there. We are seeing oil lower, that having a little to do with dollar weakness, but not too much movement in currencies. Sterling a little bit stronger. Rachel Reeves thinks that she has is in a good position to form a good relationship with Donald Trump. The Canadian dollar is a little bit stronger today, and this even as Trump says on Air Force One that he doesn't anticipate meeting with Canada, quote, for a while. He says he doesn't want to meet with Mark Carney, that Mark Carney should have pulled that Ontario ad sooner. And then the 10-year yield, as you can see, up just a little bit as that safe haven trade comes off. Coming up, risk on into 2026. Well, that seems to be still in place. We'll speak to Max Kettner of HSBC next. This is Bloomberg. It's 5:30 a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. Teed up, the U.S. and China prepare a sweeping trade deal, setting it up for Presidents Trump and Xi to finalize when they meet Thursday. Argentina decides. The country voting in Javier Milei's party in Sunday's midterms, vindicating the U.S. administration's extraordinary support for the peso. And markets back in rally mode in the United States in the run-up to Wednesday's FOMC decision and the biggest week for earnings this season. Post CPI data then Friday, we had that rally, and that continues today as we await a very likely Fed rate cut and also earnings. 5 of the Mag 7 reporting Wednesday and Thursday. And of course, the major story this week, the de-escalation that seems to be happening with China. Month to date now, we're seeing the S&P up 1.2%, the Nasdaq 100 up 2.25%, so continuing to set those records. The Russell 2000 partying along with the other indices. Let's look at yields. The 2-year back above pre-CPI levels. Investors unwinding that safe haven trade. Just below it again now, 349.68, but we are seeing the 10-year yield back above 4% and the 30-year yield back at 4.60. We're going to be looking at the Argentine peso. That'll start trading actively around 9 a.m. Eastern. We'll keep an eye out for movement after Javier Milei's party won. And then let's take a look at some commodities because we're seeing a little bit of pressure on oil, still above $60 for New York crude. Gold as well, still above 4,000, but you can see that safe haven trade just coming off across the board. Not so much for copper though, because there is now this expectation that perhaps global growth will pick up, and we're seeing copper very close to records. Now let's get to some individual stocks to watch. Over to London and Valerie Teitel. Valerie.
Good morning, Ivani. Happy Monday. The party is continuing in the Mag 7 stocks on a front foot, and NVIDIA leading those gains in the pre-market up 2.3%. This is on the back of better relations between the U.S. and China. That rare earth export restriction possibly delayed for up to a year, and that is taking at least some excitement into this AI trade with NVIDIA lifting the gains for the Mag 7. Let's check on the rare earth miners, though. Those North American miners are on a back foot. Some recent gas being taken out of this rally on that delay. We have MP Materials, who the Department of War has a direct equity stake in, down over 5%. Critical Metals and USA Rare Earths also down near 7 to 8%. Now, this is perhaps just a sign that the urgency on rare earths, this urgency to boost those North American supplies, might take just a slight back step off of this delay from China. Lastly, let's look at the pharma space. We did have a Novartis announcing an acquisition of Avidity Bioscience, a near $12 billion acquisition at $72 a share for Avidity Biosciences. So we're trading up to that acquisition price, up 43% so far in the pre-market trade for this stock. Now, this is one of the biggest acquisitions for Novartis in over a decade as they try to beef up their pipeline when it comes to experimental drugs for rare diseases. Bonnie?
Valerie, thank you so much. We'll keep an eye on all of those and a lot more today, I'm sure, as well. Valerie Teitel there. Now, Max Kettner of HSBC was risk on into 2026 even before this week's change in tone, that de-escalation with China, for example, and a potential multi-pronged trade deal with that country. Max is Chief Multi-Asset Strategist with HSBC and joins us now. So, Max, I'm not sure if we've been speaking mid last week would have been so positioned so positively, but it certainly looks like all of the challenges are out of the way now. Is there a danger that some of this falls apart and everybody just flees the market?
Yeah, good morning. Look, I think there is a danger that ultimately perhaps positioning is getting a little bit too stretched, and at some point perhaps there's a bit too much positivity creeping into markets and into expectations. That, however, I think is really only a story sometime in the first half of next year, because let's be honest, while we have seen some really nice positive earnings revisions in the last couple of months, particularly in the US and particularly driven by those companies that benefit the most from a weaker dollar. And while we have seen GDP upgrades, the level of those earnings expectations, those near-term earnings expectations, and the level of near-term GDP expectations is still fairly low. We're only talking about, barely 1% annualized GDP growth in terms of consensus expectations for Q4. When we look at now Q4 versus Q3, consensus is actually saying maybe earnings are not going to grow at all in the fourth quarter versus the reporting season that is underway right now. And of course, we look at the earnings season at the moment, and we are tracking at pretty much the best beat rate since COVID, since 2021. And all of that really tells us there is, I think, fundamentally still a lot of room to go, I think, in the next couple of weeks and months.
So I wanted to comment on something that Ed Yardeni just put out a few moments ago, actually, talking about how the Fed put is back. But he's saying that further rate cuts, perhaps after this one on Wednesday that we're very likely to get, are not now needed because both parts of the Fed's dual mandate, unemployment and inflation, are close to nirvana, is what he's saying. He's saying if we get further rate cuts, all it's going to do is send stocks higher. It's not actually going to help the labour market.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure I agree massively with that because, to be honest, when we see some pockets of weakness, that clearly is in some weaker pockets of the consumer, weaker pockets of corporates. And of course, as the rates are coming down, that should also help those parts of the consumer and of corporates. I do think, some parts of those rate cuts should help. The question, however, is if we do get now an October rate cut this week, we get a December rate cut, are we really going to see those cuts that are priced in beyond the neutral rate, that are priced in beyond the 3% terminal rate? That is, I think, where we disagree and really where we see perhaps a little bit more hawkishness in terms of what actually then unfolds relative to market pricing. Because, when we go into next year and we've already got a re-accelerating economy, corporates are actually pretty healthy, leverage is good, the labor market overall, let's be honest, when the Fed started cutting rates last year, the unemployment rate was 4.2%. It's now 4.3. It's not like, the world's changed massively, and it's not like the labor markets deteriorate significantly in the last year. So I do fear that at some point in H1 next year, there might be too much positivity creeping in terms of earnings, in terms of growth expectations, and we've cut into a re-accelerating economy. We then have growth tailwinds from the big beautiful bill, both for the consumer and for corporates. And then perhaps, at some point, the rates market will have to wake up and say, hold on, why do we need all these additional rate cuts? That's fine. We had 3 rate cuts.
Yes.
But beyond that, do we really need rate cuts beyond neutral? I think that's where we disagree.
And then stocks might take their cue from the rates market. Max, is there the potential for stocks to, say, peak, but then not have a massive sell-off, just hang out around the peak for some time until we have a clearer picture of what's going on in the economy or where there might actually be, little bubbles forming?
Yeah, look, I don't think so, actually. I don't think there is even a basis for stocks just to hang around where they are right now because, I do have these conversations a lot at the moment. Is there an AI bubble? Is there a bubble in everything, in valuations and so on? Equity markets in particular are so detached from reality and so detached from fundamentals. And then you look at the charts and you say, look, we had the best earnings beat rate in the second quarter already since 2021. We're on track to even beat that beat rate. We look at corporates themselves. US companies are net upgrading their own guidance. They're not only telling us things are okay, they're actually telling us things are even better than they themselves have expected. So I don't really agree with people who say, we can't remain detached from fundamentals forever. Well, fundamentals are genuinely strong. And then particularly in the US, particularly on the high frequency data side and on the earnings side, really since the end of the second quarter, things have been picking up and things have genuinely been re-accelerating.
There is a little bit of concern about wages, though, right, Max? I mean, if we don't get wage growth at the levels that we've been seeing it, then that's going to very much hurt the US consumer and cause a ripple effect.
Yeah, might be, but I think on the wage growth side, all the sort of classic leading indicators that we track on the job opening side, and all of that is really telling us there is a bit more slight downside ahead for wage growth overall, and then it sort of peters out. So sort of then wages hang around maybe half a percentage point lower than where we currently are. That's what most leading indicators suggest. So from that angle, I'm not very concerned, even on the overall inflation side. Yes, of course, when we look at Friday's data, goods inflation is higher. So again, that is a worry that we see some tariffs spill through and then pass through. Absolutely, but let's be honest, goods inflation is only 18% of headline CPI, and for wages to really feed into services inflation, what we would need is particularly the rental inflation, shelter inflation, to actually also go up, and then sort of see a 2022 scenario where it's not just goods inflation but super core and services and shelter,
yes,
and all the components go up at the same time. That's not what we're seeing. We are seeing still more downside in shelter inflation, not just in September, but really going forward. All the indicators, new rents, house prices, do suggest shelter inflation is still disinflationary. That is twice the weight of goods inflation. That is much, much more important.
Max, always an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Can't wait for Wednesday. That is Max Kettner of HSBC. Now to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent confirming the names of 5 finalists to succeed Fed Chair Powell. The candidates are current Fed board members Christopher Waller and Michelle Bowman, former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh, White House National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett, and BlackRock executive Rick Rieder. President Trump said he expects that Scott Bessent will make the decision along with him by year end. President Trump ruling out the idea of running as vice presidential candidate in the 2028 election. This has his supporters urge him to find ways to circumvent the Constitution's prohibition on a president being elected to 3 terms. Commenting on the issue, the president told reporters, quote, "It's too cute." And Hurricane Melissa became the Atlantic season's 3rd Category 5 storm in the Caribbean. The U.S. National Hurricane Center said it's now expected to make landfall early Tuesday in Jamaica, as well as neighboring Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, where it will make a 2nd landfall Wednesday. Coming up, President Trump touches down in Tokyo for the next string in high-stakes meetings in his Asia trip. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Well, the stage has been set for President Trump and Xi as top trade negotiators say they have come to agreement on a range of topics, including export controls, fentanyl, shipping levies. President Trump now also suggesting he may drop an investigation into whether China violated the terms of his first-term trade deal. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Brendan Murray. Brendan, there was friction literally until last week. How is it that everything can be solved already? Is it possible?
Yeah, it's gone 180 degrees, the rhetoric between the U.S. and China. It sounds like the 2 leaders are heading toward a meeting, a face-to-face meeting on Thursday, where they will sort of solidify some of these things that have been hammered out over the weekend. That is, China buying more U.S. soybeans. The U.S. would consider lowering tariffs, specifically the fentanyl tariffs, the 20% that Trump imposed on Chinese imports. So I think what the best that they can hope for is that they would push out any sort of escalation that either side have threatened, the export controls or the tariffs, out further than the 3-month series of rounds of talks that we've had over the past 5 months. Secretary Bessent meeting 5 times with his counterpart to try to calm the tensions between the 2 largest economies. So it looks like the stage is set. The market looks confident that the U.S. and China are not going to be in a protracted, heated trade war in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, rare earths, I suppose, the biggest issue of them all. Is it going to be just, we'll push out the tariffs as long as you extend the rare earths truce, or will there be some kind of a middle ground that will be permanent?
Yeah, that's what the U.S. is expecting, is that China would give the U.S. and companies all over the world some sort of clarity and certainty about the flow of those rare earth, the magnets in particular, the things that power all sorts of electronics and defense equipment, and really just a lot of high-tech industrial machinery these days. Most companies don't carry more than a couple of months of a stockpile of those. So if China starts making those permits tough to come by, then you can see how the global economy sort of seizes up fairly quickly. So the U.S. wants assurances that China is going to let those magnets flow. It sounds like Secretary Bessent has some assurances from his counterparts that that's what they're going to get. So it seems like the two leaders are going to get together later this week and announce this framework. Soybean prices are rallying today on the expectation that China is going to buy a lot more of them. So things seem to be moving in a much more positive direction than they were a week ago.
Well, and then over the weekend, we also got Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand. Talk to us about those bilateral deals and what the U.S. gets out of them.
Yeah, so there were basically two what you would call trade deals, one with Cambodia, the other one with Malaysia. The other two, one with Vietnam and the other one with Thailand, were more what they call frameworks, which are more outlines of deals that they'll still have to work out the details for. One of the big things that stands out that's not going to happen, though, on this trip for President Trump is a deal with South Korea. It sounds like those details are really getting difficult for the two sides to get to the finish line on. And so the South Korea deal doesn't look like it's going to happen. That, of course, South Korea being a much bigger economy than those other four that they've announced. So that could be seen as a disappointment from the Trump administration side. But they are trying to rack up these deals on the president's trip through Asia. He's in Japan now, and they'll, of course, be talking about the U.S.-Japan deal that was hammered out over the past couple of months.
Yeah, and actually, we'll go to Stephen Engel on that. Bloomberg's Brendan Murray, thank you so much for all of that context. So as Brendan was saying, President Trump has arrived now in Japan, preparing to meet with the new Prime Minister. Joining us now from Tokyo is Bloomberg's Stephen Engel. Sanae Takaichi is going to want something good out of this, Stephen. She's just been named Prime Minister. It was a difficult fight, but she's very, very popular in polling. It seems that, 74% of people polled, according to a Nikkei poll, have optimism over her economic agenda. She's going to want to take this into the Trump meeting, isn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a bit of a honeymoon period. This is Japan's first female prime minister. So she's seeing some popularity boost. Obviously, the last two prime ministers, Kishida and Ishiba, were sort of revolving door prime ministers following, of course, the lengthy premiership of Shinzo Abe, who was really the mentor to Takaichi-san here. She was quite pained by his assassination in 2022. Donald Trump, of course, had a good relationship with Shinzo Abe, according to him. It was actually here at the Akasaka Palace 6 years ago, where I was in this exact same spot where Donald Trump came in and did meet with Shinzo Abe in Akasaka Palace behind me. I can't confirm that the meeting between Takaichi and Trump will happen here, but this is the state guest house, so my guess is that the meeting tomorrow morning that has already been announced between Trump and Takaichi-san will likely happen here, and they do have a lot to talk about. Obviously, Takaichi-san is more, I guess you could say, more of a nationalistic leader. She wants to get cooperation and coordination with the United States on ways that Donald Trump has expressed as well, and that is to counter efforts by China to sort of change the global world order. And Takaichi-san would like to coordinate better with Donald Trump and his administration. However, there are military spending issues. Japan has a pacifist constitution. Takaichi-san wants to increase defense spending in Japan, accelerated by 2 years, the plan to increase spending by up to 2% of GDP fairly soon. And that would be music to Donald Trump's ears unless he feels it's not enough. The Europeans are talking about 5% of GDP. Japan, 2%. And of course, there are the threats from North Korea. North Korea has been rattling its sabers of late. And of course, some of those missiles that they've fired have gone over Japanese territory. So there's lots of issues, including that trade deal that was signed in January, as well as the LNG purchases that the Japanese are buying from Russia. So lots to talk about tomorrow morning.
Can't wait to hear more. Stephen, thank you so much for that. That is Bloomberg's Stephen Engel in Tokyo. Well, Well, over in Argentina, President Javier Milei's party won the midterm vote yesterday in a major comeback. He spoke to reporters after his victory.
The Argentinians showed that they don't want to return to the failed model. Argentinians told populism to stop. Populism never again.
For more, Bloomberg's Jorgelina de Rosario joins us now. Jorgelina, this was a little bit of a surprise, but it's certainly being very, very well taken by markets right now. Why is that?
It was a surprise. It was a great night last night for Javier Milei in Argentina after securing almost 41% of a nationwide vote in a midterm election. It was well above expectations of what the government was expecting, but also what the market was expecting. After the government lost in a local election in the largest district of Argentina, the Buenos Aires province, back in September. Now, this reassurance is a good news for markets. We are expecting a rally in stocks, in bonds, and also a recovery on the peso after these results. That basically it's a boost for Milei's governability after he was elected president back in 2023, and this will allow him to get the reforms that he needs, because this midterm election means that now he will have the necessary seats in the Congress, especially in the lower house, first to regain the veto power to reject any of the bills that he might not like, his government might not like to move forward to a legislation, but also to secure the alliances that he will need to seek in the Congress in itself to push for the reforms that he's looking for, whether it is labor reform, tax reform, or pensions reform. This is a vote of confidence that Milei administration needing from the Argentines to seek those reforms and continue his next 2 years of government.
Of course, big backing from the United States as well. Jorgelina, thank you so much. That is Bloomberg's Jorgelina de Rosario. Coming up, a busy week of trade talks, earnings, and of course, that rate decision. The week ahead is next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Now a look at what's ahead this week. Some key meetings in Asia on deck. Of course, President Trump likely to meet the new Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi on Tuesday. Then the APEC summit kicks off in South Korea, where Presidents Trump and Xi will talk later in the week. It's also the busiest week for earnings. Meta, Google and Microsoft reporting Wednesday, Apple and Amazon Thursday, and Exxon and Chevron Friday. And finally, it is not just the Fed. We have three major central bank decisions. The Fed's Wednesday, obviously, followed by the BOJ and the ECB on Thursday. So we really couldn't be better set up for a Monday, right? And you can see that reflected in futures. After a 2.5% gain almost so far into October, we're seeing the Nasdaq 100 hit records and futures pointed very much higher today. You're seeing the safety trade come off, as you can see in the 10-year yield, and gold still above 4,000, but just barely. That's it for Bloomberg Brief. Surveillance continues the conversation. This is Bloomberg.